Alright, Jake Villwock here. We're gonna tie a pretty big and exciting fly. I tied the same exact fly, slightly smaller for smallmouth bass, but this one in particular I was tying for stripers out on the Jersey coast. Want to talk a little bit about the head real quick. So this head is the Flyman Howitzer head. Absolutely love this thing, pushes a lot of water. But to finish the heads, I've messed around with all kinds of different UVs, non-UV curing stuff, and they never seem to get quite the sheen that I want or the structure, the durability of them. This particular one, or all of my heads now I should say, are tied, finished with, not tied with, Raid Zap UV glue that is UV cured. What I do is I hit it really fast, make sure it's set, and then I'll take them outside. When I batch paint them, and I'll set them outside for 10 minutes, and they are completely tack free, and you can smash them pretty good, and they just kind of come right back up. I paint these. I use the airbrush stuff. I'll do 2 or 3 different colors depending on how I want to get them, kind of tapered up. The blue one that we're going to tie, I do like a light blue and then a dark blue, so you do get kind of that transition, and then use a little bit of red on the bottom for that kind of that bleeding throat there. But we're going to tie a blue and white one. I love blue and white. It's easy to see on the water. There are plenty of bait fish out there that have blue on top, but in all honesty, most of the time you're fishing a popper, the top part is for the angler, not for the fish, because they're seeing the bottom. So we want to make sure that bottom looks pretty natural, and I want it to be relatively easy to cast. But let's be honest, these little stop sign of heads right here are really hard. So I cast this particular size on an 11 weight. If you have about a 2-foot leader, you can do it on a 10 weight, but the 11s turn them over way easier in the wind. So let's go ahead and get started with this guy. First thing we're going to do, put this hook in here. These are the big game jaws from Regal, so I'm going to show you that it's a little crooked right now because I've got it in one of these grooves that they have, and it's really important to get these things in the grooves, because once they're in the grooves, they're not going anywhere. So use the vise and all of the techniques and structure that it's for. First thing we're going to do after the hook, we're going to go ahead and start our thread base. We're going all the way back. The thread we're using is Danville 210 in a Chartreuse color, and I'll explain why we're using Danville instead of some sort of gel spun when we're going to be messing with some deer hair. So we're going to start with a little spine of deer hair here. I love to use deer hair as a spine for anytime I'm going to put feathers off the back end, because it really just adds a little bit extra structure. But what it also does when you tie in this bucktail is it creates kind of a little platform here to tie that material in on. So you've got your kind of rough idea of how much space you're going to use for this. So I'm going to trim off all those little excess pieces, and then we're going to take some Blue Krystal Flash, and we're going to cut off about 4 strands of it. You don't need a lot, because what we're going to do is we're going to fold it over. So we're gonna keep using that, so I'm gonna leave that right there. So we're gonna take this flash and fold it over the thread. So now you've got 8 strands. Slide that straight down on top. The first pull over is gonna lay that right on the top of there, and then we're just gonna throw that in there. So this one in particular, again, we can have it. It's gonna be pretty long, so I'm not gonna trim that flash. Having that flash hang out is not a bad thing. Then we're gonna take a white and a blue saddle hackle feather, and the blue and the white are going to be roughly the same size, but if you wanted to make one a little longer than the other, you could. We're going to trim off all of that fluff. Now there's 2 different ways you can tie these in. You can either smash the barb of the quill down so that it's flat, and we'll try both ways to see which one works better. But the other way you can do is actually take this quill and just tie it right on the top of the shank, and a lot of times that will actually bring that straight over, which is what we want. So that worked out really well. We're going to leave that right there, trim that down. The other way you can do it is you can, and we'll see if this works, and sometimes I shoot myself in the foot when I do this because it doesn't work. We're going to pull off all that fluff, and the only reason I do that is because it's easier to tie in. I'm going to take a pair of hemostats with a flat edge, and we're just going to smash that quill down. Now what will happen is sometimes if the quill or the stem is too stiff, it'll spin it, and you'll notice right there it didn't work. So we're gonna go over that feather a little bit and just mash it down a lot and see if this works. Then we're gonna come over, I'm gonna lay this flat on the side, and we're gonna tie that in. So it kind of worked, but it's kind of a little bit flared out, and I don't like that. So we're just gonna do exactly what we did on the other ones. We're gonna lay those right on the top, tie that in, and that's gonna give me a pretty straight tail piece right there. I'm gonna cut that off without moving it too much. Now before I do anything else, I'm gonna look. So right there, see that feather flared like that? I'm just gonna pull that feather out, and I'm gonna retie that in to make sure it doesn't do that again. If it keeps doing that, the only thing you can do is grab another feather or hope that something different happens every time you tie it in. But so that just still didn't work quite the way I wanted it to. So I'm gonna take this feather out. We're gonna grab another feather. Actually, both of those look a little funny. So I'm gonna peel that off just a tiny bit. Lay that back down. See if I can get that right on the top. Okay. We got that. That one worked. So we'll take our second blue one, and we're gonna do the same thing. We're just gonna peel off all that excess, and we're just gonna lay that right on the top. And again, this is true time. There's no fly tyer out there that's ever tied with rooster saddles that hasn't dealt with this before. So, you know, even though we're supposed to make it look as smooth as possible, now you know what actually happens sometimes. To add a little bit of structure to that, we're gonna hit this with some UV glue. This is UV flow, so we're just gonna cover up all of that. One other thing you can do if you're getting into some, you know, kind of toothier big game or something that's really gonna pull, you can take a UV flex and actually run it down the spine of those feathers, maybe a ½ inch, hit them, and that's gonna create a little bit more stability in there. It's also gonna give it a little structure coming off the back of there, but we're pretty good on that. Now we're going to advance our thread forward just a little bit. And again, we want this fly to be kind of big and obnoxious. So, you know, longer tails are not a bad thing. Now what we're going to do, as I've moved my thread forward just a little bit, we're going to start doing the body. And as we do the body, we're going to use white bucktail and we're going to use some blue bucktail. I'm going to start on the bottom. And we don't want to use a lot because, again, we're going to tie it. Well, I shouldn't say again, I haven't told you this yet. But we are going to tie in about 4 clumps of bucktail. So you don't want to just go big and bulky right off the bat. One thing that I really like is to make my flies blend together. I don't like to have this bulky head and then a super skinny tail. I call it a lollipop fly. So we're going to kind of still try to create a circular or round fly, even though we're going to do multiple times bucktail. So I want that bucktail to go back about 2/3 the length of that, that feather. So we're going to lay this on the bottom, and we're going to lay it on my side. 1 wrap, 2 wrap, pull tight. Now that's going to slide a little bit, but that's okay because we want this to really kind of go all the way down the sides of the shank. We want it, I'm sorry, not down. We want it to kind of come up. This one's on the bottom. So we want it to come up that shank just a little bit so that when we put the blue in, they go right together and marry themselves in. So we're going to start a little bit shorter. This is a really long fibered bucktail. These are by Brad Buzzy in New Jersey. Dyes some absolute amazing bucktail. And we're gonna do the same with the blue. Now, I'm gonna show you this. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon that doesn't happen often, but you'll notice all those bucktail fibers are the same length. I don't want that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna kind of spread that out a little bit, giving myself a little tiny bit of a taper. We're gonna do the same thing we did on the bottom as the top. 1 wrap, 2 wrap, pull tight. Now, one thing I didn't show you that you can do with this stuff, and I'm gonna take this bucktail off and show you because this didn't flare quite the way I wanted it to, and I don't want to pull any harder on 210 because sometimes 210 will break. So I'm gonna unwrap this, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna spin my bobbin. I'm gonna spin that, and that's gonna take those little fibers and they're gonna really wrench them together and almost create a gel spun. And then I can really yank on that thing and it'll spin right around. So we've got our kind of married color there. It's not laying too high, so when it gets wet, it's just going to mat down right over top of that and create that nice structure of the body. Just do 1 or 2 more securing wraps to make sure it doesn't move too much. We're going to trim off all this excess. And as we go forward, we're going to create microstructure. And I've mentioned this in a few of my other videos or classes, but microstructure basically means that there's little steps in this fly that's going to create bulkiness to it, and you're going to get that kind of like taper to it. So before we go any further, I'm going to add a little bit of flash. Now for this one, and again, this is kind of minute, me being a little OCD, I'm going to take 2 pieces of flash, one attached to me, and I'm going to fold it in half, get it roughly the same length, and I'm going to cut that in half. So now we have 4 pieces, and I'm going to make this about the length of that bucktail. And I'm going to lay that flat on the top because we want it to flare out just a little bit. This is just going to create a tiny little bit of opaqueness or translucence, not opaqueness, that's the opposite of that. Fold that over. Now I've got just a little bit of flash. We don't need a lot of flash, that's just a little bit. Repeat that step again, but I will mention this is not a bad idea. Every single time you tie in bucktail, throw a little bit of UV glue around that junction, and that's going to help keep those fibers stuck in there. Because one thing that does happen occasionally is when you tie in bucktail, you don't get every single strand. So if fish eats it, slowly starts to pull those strands out, weakens up that thread, and next thing you know, you're stuck with a fly that's got nothing but a head left on it. So this time we're going to start from the top of the fly. So we're going to grab a little bit more blue, and every time I tie it in, I'm going to make that deer hair a little shorter as I go forward, and that's going to continue that taper, but it's also going to flare it up. And so you're going to get that taper going this way, but you're not going to have that hard stop of material back there. So before I tie this in, we're going to go ahead and spin that. Now, I don't want to make it too small, too fast. So we're going to just flare that up, making sure, kind of covering up about halfway. Flare that up a little bit, move it with your hands. You're going to notice you're going to get a good little flare there. The other thing I'm also doing as I'm tying this is I'm tying down the bucktail. And as I tie down the bucktail, the fibers get a little bit stiffer, so a little bit sturdier. And that's going to, again, part of the creating microstructure is really going to help with that. So spin this bad boy over, measure those out to roughly where we want them. I'm laying this bucktail on my side of the shank, so when I pull it, it's going to then pull it straight over that shank. And that's going to make it so it doesn't go one way or the other too unevenly. So now I've got a pretty even wrap there. If you don't like the way it is, you can always just migrate it a little bit before you put in your securing wrap. A couple securing wraps there. And again, this thing gets wet. That's one thing that I get stuck on a lot myself, is like seeing some sort of imperfection in there, and then I realize as soon as it gets wet, that imperfection either disappears or doesn't matter. So, or if it looks perfect, there's a good chance you're going to get an imperfection from a fish anyway. So that's just how it is. Now, same thing we did before, 2 strands of this stuff. Basically from here until we get close to the front, we're just going to repeat the steps that we do. However, we will add one new step here. So we're going to add that flash, just tie that right on the top. Having it kind of go over the top is pretty good. It kind of, that way it's not just like a straight line of flash over the top. Next thing we're going to do on this particular step is we're going to add a couple feathers going forward. Now, this is a pretty wispy feather right here. So I'm going to grab, this is a saltwater cape. So these are going to be a little bit stiffer, but I just looked at that feather and I was like, that's not going to give me exactly what I'm looking for on the side. I don't want these giant feathers, so we're gonna downsize to something that's a little bit smaller. Still has a lot of movement, but it's a little smaller. So I'm gonna peel this, kind of get that about the length of the last section of bucktail that we have tied in. Get that about right there, and we're gonna tie that in right on the top and hope that that doesn't flare too much. And this is just adding a little bit of kind of a lateral line look to it, but also just a little bit extra movement. And you know, bucktail Bucktail moves okay, but not great. So if we can add a couple feathers to this, that's going to add a nice bit of movement there. So you'll notice that before I cinched down on that last one, I moved forward a little bit because I've got those securing wraps right here. Moved forward, pulled it down once. That way I have these feathers set nicely, but then they don't flare out because I really cinch them down. And then again, just to secure this in there, throw a little bit of glue on there. What we're going to probably end up with is 3 tie-ins of bucktail before we get to the head part. Now, these heads, I've already poked a hole through them, and we're just going to slide that right on so you can kind of get a rough idea. But I like to have a little bit too much material forward so when you push it back, there's not a gap in the material itself between the head, because the last thing I want to do is have this beautiful looking fly and then this giant kind of gap in between there when it's wet. So now we'll switch it over to go to the bottom first. Again, shortening our bucktail a little bit, and when I start to shorten it, what I do is I stack that just a hair, just to get a little bit more body in there. On my side, pull that down, and just make sure that it doesn't spin too much. One thing I did not mention in this, but I will do so now, is you'll notice that I have a pretty light thread base on there. I want a little bit of thread on there to help make sure this doesn't just free spin, but the less thread you have on the hook of a shank, the easier it is to spin bucktail. So if you end up with, you know, less than ideal, you know, not the greatest of bucktail, and you know, that you bought from, you know, I don't know, a bargain bin or something like that, it makes it easier to spin that stuff. What you really want to look for in bucktail, and this is a great example, is you can see it's pretty stiff, but it's also pretty thick. Bucktail is a hollow fiber, so what you want is these kind of wispy ends, but also having that kind of thicker hollow end. What you don't want, after I tie this in, I'll show you what you don't want, because I can show you exactly what we're looking at. I'm gonna wrap that. It's gonna flare itself over the edge. So when you look at a bucktail, you get with this like kind of thinner stuff up here, and then as you get down here, you get this really stiff, that's super thick, but you notice how stiff that is? That's not gonna fold very well. That's gonna keep its structure a little too much, and it just doesn't work quite as well. So if you find a bucktail that's got, you know, that you're having issues spinning and you go to the extra thick stuff, you're not going to get it to fold over itself the way you want it to. So always pay attention to the butts of it. And then, you know, if you're tying some stuff that doesn't need like super long fibers, and you're going to a fly show or something like that, go to the guy that's selling a super fancy long bucktail for saltwater guy stuff and say, hey, you got any junk? And he'll pull out a little bag of stuff underneath the table that he doesn't want to show anybody and say, I got this. And you say, cool, that's what I want. You want the stuff that's a little shorter, that's going to really add, you know, that's going to give you that length, but also have that structure to flare out. So now we're going to go back to the flash. Again, just kind of continuing our steps here. You could definitely get away with just taking 8 little strands of flash and tied it in and, you know, kind of measuring it out and all that stuff. But for me, I'm not tying commercially, and this way I save a lot of waste. You know, you end up throwing a lot of material away. So that's why I like to only go with exactly what I need. If I'm using a like a something, a palmer, like one of those like ooh, this is good. I just lost what I was gonna say. UV polar chenilles or something like that, I don't cut a piece off and then wrap it. What I do is I keep the whole entire strand, wrap it until I'm done, cut it off, and then that way I have no waste. And that's really important, because fly tying material is not getting any cheaper. So the longer you can hold the stuff that you have, the better, and kind of go from there. So that's gonna be our third tie-in. We're gonna UV this guy, just like that. If I was, say, with, for instance, this guy right here, so you've got a little bit of a darker top, you'll notice, or if you don't notice, I'll show you, you've got light olive in the back. tapering to a darker olive on there. So a lot of times, like this one in particular, it's very blue, but that's because we're going blue, light blue to dark blue. So there will be a change in that color a little bit, but when I'm doing this, I'm not changing the color as I go. There are times where I'll do like a chartreuse head and I'll start olive and white, and then I'll just add one chartreuse and then go back and just kind of add that nice taper to the color till you get to the head. So paying attention to that's really important. So all right, so we've got that in. We're gonna do one more tie in a bucktail. Now this time we're gonna reverse tie it because we're gonna want to start filling in the gaps of that. We want a little bit more structure on the back, so I don't need a lot of bucktail. We're gonna make sure we don't have too much. Cut that off. And you're gonna notice too, if I put this over here, we're kind of running out of room, but that's what I want. I want to run out of room before I put this head on. So we're gonna reverse tie this in. Now before I do that, I am gonna spin this, but you'll notice I don't have a lot of bucktail. It's not, you're getting bulk with the repeatability of this step. So when I do this, it's gonna slide back like that, and you're gonna get a little bit of extra height, which is what I'm trying to do. So we're gonna slide down a little further on the white. We're gonna measure this direction, chop that off, flip this over. Oh, before I do that, I'll spin this. That way we'll get a nice flare of that. Now, fancy little tool here called a proto john. It's amazing for pushing this bucktail back over itself in a really even manner. If you use a Bic pen, a lot of times if you've got structure, a little too much structure on one side, it'll slide that bucktail one way or the other. If you can't find these, you don't want to buy these, take a Bic pen and a little knife and just rough up the edges a little bit. So we're gonna push this back right over top of that. And you're gonna notice pretty fast that you can adjust where you want that to be, but that's gonna add a lot of structure to this. So we're just gonna fold this back. Then what I'm gonna do is where that junction was in that little tiny, flare of the butt section, it's gonna create a little bit of a hole in there. Now we've got a little beautiful little tie-in point right there. That's kind of like a structure, but you'll notice too, we've got length going this way, and now we're getting this taper up, and that taper up is because we're actually going smaller on the bucktail, and that bucktail is flaring a little bit more as it goes. And then we're gonna start to taper back down to the head. So every fish goes to little to nothing, body to the head. So this is where we get that kind of structure to that head. Now, just like we did 2 steps ago, we're gonna add a couple more feathers on there just for a little bit extra movement. And you can use kind of whatever color feathers you want on this, but I'm trying to kind of keep the blue alive here. So that worked out well, right over the top. Okay. Whoops. See how I did there? Moved my feather. Don't want to do that. Beautiful. Now, on this step, instead of adding more flash, I'm going to take, you can use whatever color you want. This just happens to be blue dyed peacock herl, and this is going to add that kind of dark back strap to this fly. So this is going to give us a little tiny bit of contrast in color, but on the very top of every single minnow on this planet, there's a dark line. So just to kind of add to that blue scheme, we're going to throw that up there. Now I don't want it to be super long. I want it to kind of marry straight down in there, and that's going to kind of add that in there nice. Now we're just going to trim this extra stuff off here. We're going to hit this with a little bit of UV glue. Make sure those feathers are in there nice and neat. Alright, now the last step, and again you'll notice that we don't have a lot of space there, but that's what I want, because if I push that on right now, you can't see it, or maybe you can. The hook eye is almost out, but you've got that giant gap right there, and that just doesn't look nice. And even if you push this back, when the bucktail gets wet, it's gonna fold over. So I like to really try to crowd the eye on these. And to do that, we're gonna go a little contrasting color here, and we're gonna create a throat with some red Arctic fox. Now, this particular Arctic fox is the tail. So these are the tail medallions. I'm gonna take my little dubbing brush that has a comb on it. I'm just gonna comb out some of that, not much. And we're gonna reverse tie this. I'm gonna kind of come up over top of that white just a little bit, and we're just gonna reverse tie. That's gonna give us a little bit of a flare there, which is what we're looking for. And we're gonna do the same thing. But again, because we have a little bit darker blue in the middle, we're gonna go with a slightly darker blue. This is Kingfisher Blue Arctic Fox. So this is like what they call a medallion. So you kind of peel that out to get to the end of it. Now, with this one, this is a great example of different lengths that you'll get if you go to a fly shop. So you saw the length of the red. The red's not super long. This is about twice as long as that. What I don't want to do is pull out a lot of the bottom of this. I want to get a little bit out just so it flares. But if you start pulling out all the fluffy stuff, you're going to lose all your structure. So to get the right length, I'm actually going to pull out some of this guard hair. I'm not going to pull out all of it, but I'm going to pull out some of it. And that's going to give me, you know, a nice structure to kind of lay over top of that. Again, measuring, I like to measure this way just to make sure. So we'll just kind of, I lost my scissors in my pile of blue stuff. So we'll reverse tie this again, right over the top. Now, what I'm not going to do is worry about any UV glue, because we're going to use super glue. So I'm going to make a really giant whip finish right here, and I'm going to show you why. And we're going to whip finish that off. It broke, but it didn't broke in the right spot, so that's good. So now I've got all this stuff. So before we go ahead and throw any glue on this thing and make a mess and get stuff tangled up, what I'm going to do is, like I did with this little Proto-John, you can push that back and see what it looks like if you want. But I'm actually, well hell, we'll do that anyway. I'm going to push this on, and you'll notice immediately that kind of fills it up. But I don't have it all the way through yet. So I'm going to push that until I get that hook straight through there. And that's what you're going to get your structure, because when that gets wet, I mean, that's the smallest it'll ever be, but that water is going to come around that head and it's going to give that gap. So that's going to fill in that gap and create that almost seamless connection there. So now that I have that, I'm going to pull this head back off, and I'm going to cover this with super glue, which I'm lucky was continued. So yes, you see that stuff flared forward. That's okay, because now that we've pulled it back once, it's pretty easy to get that to come back again. We're going to cover the shank with glue, but I'm also going to cover a little bit of that fox with glue. I'm going to hold that just like that, push that through, and then when I pull that all the way through, I'm going to make sure that the hook eye is all the way out. I'm going to hold that for a few seconds because you don't want it to push forward. Once I do that, it's good to go. Now, I like to use this Ahrex trout predator for this for a couple different reasons. One, because yes, it's not stainless, but it is that black nickel finish, which has a lot of, you can use it in the saltwater. I love the gauge of this hook, but you can also see the hook gap. There's a good hook gap. I see a lot of people tie poppers, and I'm like, how are you ever going to catch a fish with that? What I like to do is take my finger and run it straight underneath of that popper head. If I can run that straight under that popper head and not feel the hook, that means I've got enough structure. Because French and stripers are going to eat from the head like this, which means that they're going to clamp down on it this way, and when you yank it out, it's going to go straight into the top of their mouth. Pike, muskie, sometimes will eat it from the side. You've got plenty for that mouth to go around and then get into that hook section. So pay attention to that. The other saltwater specific hook I use a lot is the Clouser signature hook in either a 4 or a 5/0. I like the 5/0 just because of the hook gap, but the 4/0 has about the same shank length as the 4/0 Predator, and that really hurt. Now I'm bleeding. So this is my kind of Predator popper. Like I mentioned, this is the biggest version. I also tie it the once in a medium and then actually in a small, not using quite as much bucktail. And as you go smaller, you're obviously going to change the amount of material you use, but that is going to give you kind of that. And then you can see that bottom. That's why I kind of brushed that with a little bit of red in there, because then it kind of just flares right into that, and you've got your, you know, blue water popper. So thank you.